sometime. Tuesday, wasn't there. Wednesday wasn't there. Thursday wasn't there. Friday, I got my route Friday morning, and I had one delivery in Jasper, Alabama. So I went to the hospital. I clocked out and told them I was going to see a terminally ill patient. I went in, and the nurse, or no, the other daughter came to the door and said, I told her who it was because I had not met her, and she said, he's on morphine. He doesn't know anything that's going on, but certainly you can come in and talk with him. I went in and talked with him, and sure enough, he woke up and talked to me because we'd become that close. And then I went next door, talked to his wife, who's dementia, and she said, Harry, Les is in the hospital. And then before I left, she said, Harry, we don't know where Les is. Of course, that's common. But I prayed with both of them before I left. That was Friday. This morning at 7:45, I got a text from Terry, the daughter, and said, Dad passed last night. Now, you can say that that's just coincidence. I say God goes before you. And I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had to do some things, all at God's direction, not anything that I did or we did. But I just wanted you to say, I believe in this verse. Sometimes it's difficult. And like Justin talked about prayer this morning, I'm so convinced that prayer is so significant in the life of everyone, but especially of a Christian. And I wish in my earlier life I had really known how important prayer is. And I'm not going to add anything to it, just gives you a listing here. Basically 3 groups of 4, with Peter always being the first one in it. The one we're going to talk about tonight is Simon the Zealot, and he's our 10th in the listing seen by Luke and Acts. And if you look at it here, you can see over on the right too, he's number 10, and the others he's number 11. But I used this one as the one that he was the 10th one. Now, look at these 4 verses up here. Then I'm going to ask you a question. I want somebody to tell me everything you can tell me that you know that you can find in the Bible about Simon a Zealot. Tell me everything you know.
Yeah, that's it.
Now, Karen says that's it.
I always wondered, though, if he's called Simon Zelotes.
Zelotes, yeah.
I wonder how he got along with Matthew.
Well, we're going to talk about that, Karen. That's a good point. How long to get along with Matthew? And that's one of the points in here, so remind me when we get to there. That's everything we know about Simon a Zealot. And that's a little bit surprising, isn't it? He's one of the chosen 12, and we know nothing about him but these verses. I'm going to show you something about these verses that's important. First of all, here's the comparison between 2 versions. In the King James Version and actually in the New King James Version, he's referred to as Simon the Canaanite. You see that in the first 2, and then Luke calls him Simon Zelotes, which means zealot. Over here in the other, Simon a Zealot, Simon a Zealot, and Simon a Zealot. What's happening, Matt? Okay, and here's the New American Standard Version, which uses Simon the Zealot also. Now, let me point out there are 3 terms that we find here: the Canaanite in one of them, the Zealot, Zelotes in another, and Zealot in the others. The word Canaanite is an incorrect translation of the word Cananitas, meaning a zealot. So the translation would, early Christian writers referred to it as Canaanite, and that was actually inaccurate, which Canaanean is the Aramaic term for zealot, the way it should have been translated. And of course, zelotes means zealot. And of course, we know that a zealot is one who has a zeal for a particular cause. And Paul uses this in some of his writings. gave us one here in Titus 2:4, who gave himself for us that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify himself unto a peculiar people, meaning zealous or zealots who do good works. Or Paul says, I was zealous, or I was a zealot toward God. So that's a common term. I'll be honest with you, growing up, I thought of the word zealot as being a very negative term because I had associated it with people that kill people. And zealots did do that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And here's the English translation renders the word zelotes is an adjective form, but normally, original meaning, it was in the a noun, and this is always refers to as people or groups of people, like Hartselle, loyalists, and so forth. So that's what you'll find. You'll find the word zelotes, or you'll find somebody being zealous as an adjective form. And here Paul uses it in Acts 22:3. He talks about himself and was zealous toward God. Galatians 1:4, being exceedingly zelotes, or zealous of the traditions of my fathers, which he was. And then Strong's Concordance just talks about zelotes here being normally an adjectively, I didn't know that was such a word, of being zealous. And some scholars would argue that Paul was a zealot, as in Simon a zealot. Personally, I think Paul was just a zealous man toward anything in which he believed. And yeah, he was a zealot, but I don't think he was a member of the zealot group as we know of. Now, I'm going to deviate because if I just told you everything I knew about Simon the Zealot, we'd be through right now because there's nothing more. But I want to take you through some things that bring us to the end to talk a little bit more about Simon the Zealot. But there were 4 groups or sects of people that we know a lot about. Well, 3 of them we know quite a bit. 2 of them we know a lot about. The other 2 not as much. But the Pharisees, and this brings us back to what Kara was saying about Matthew a while ago. We'll talk about him later. But the Pharisees were people that means separated ones. Now, they could be ones that did separate themselves from society in some regard, or they separated themselves to the study of the law. Probably some of both concepts. I'd always thought of the Pharisees as being a huge group of people. From all the readings I've done, especially Josephus, he says there were about 6,000 of them in Jesus' day. And I'd always thought them being a larger group, but more that I studied, it seems like that's probably a pretty accurate group. Some of the things they believed in, of course, the one God. They accepted all the Old Testament, believed in angels and demons, believed in an afterlife, a resurrection. And that's critical to notice that. Not as much interested in politics. They control the synagogues, so therefore they control much of the Jewish population. They wanted to convert people to their beliefs as long as you believe the way we do. They taught the written and the oral law. The way to God was through the way to obedience to the law, the way they interpret it. Somewhat progressives of their day, and rejected Jesus because he did not accept their interpretations. And this would probably describe something we might have seen in that day. Pharisees talked with Jesus, said, so you don't see the law as we do, is that correct? And Jesus would have answered, oh, I believe in the law, it's just not the way you use your traditions and your interpretations always. So that was one of the disagreements they had. Sadducees. You remember? Pharisees, religious-wise. Sadducees were the aristocrats and were part of the wealthy. That included the high priest families, and the high priest was usually a very wealthy man, basically bought his job in most cases. They had charge of the temple. And you remember when Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, who was he driving out? Sadducees. Why were they so upset? That's how they made their money. That's why the Sadducees were the wealthy people, because they actually cheated people in many cases by selling all of the things for the sacrifices. So they were wealthy, and that's why they were so disagreed with Jesus, because he drove them out and took away their job at that time. They claimed to be descendants of Zadok, a high priest of David in Solomon's time, and yes, Zadok was a faithful priest back during David and Solomon's time. And Ezekiel said that since they were the faithful ones at the time of exile, they would be allowed to serve in future temple duties. So the Sadducees would say, listen, we take all of our history back to Zadok. And actually, I wish Beth were in here because she knows Latin and how all this is translated. But the word Sadducees is actually a derivation of Zadok. The Z becomes, no, S's are not in the language, but Z's are. And so they could trace their lineage back to there, but they call themselves the Sadducees, back to the early times of David. They opposed the oral law. Remember, the Pharisees promoted it. They opposed it. Of course, the Pentateuch, the Torah, the word Torah and law actually mean the same thing, but actually law is sort of a misinterpretation of the word Torah, because the first 5 books are really not law. They're more like a history material. But anyway, they call that the law, the Torah. And the Sadducees at the bottom did not believe in life after death, therefore not concerned with rewards or punishment beyond or after this life. And this was one of the things that I think probably they argued with Jesus about. I certainly don't believe all that resurrection teaching for Jesus. It just isn't true. And that became very significant in the time of Christ about Pharisees and Sadducees. Denied the existence of angels and demons, believed God to be free to live, believed people to be free to live as they wish, like God doesn't care. A little bit of this side, God created us, but he just took his hands off and said, okay, y'all do what you want to do. I don't really care. That's basically their mindset. Very politically oriented, where the Pharisees were not as much. They were political in their religious ways, but not political as far as society was concerned. They tolerated no threats to their position and wealth, so they strongly opposed Jesus, just like he did when he drove them out of the temple. And I put this little slide in here just to help you to remember. A member of this group would be the one who did not believe in a resurrection, and that is very sad, you see. That's how you can remember that. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. A third group, well, here's just a slide. I'm not going to go over it, but it shows you the Pharisees on the left, the Sadducees on the right, and look at the ones in the middle here where I have them highlighted. Believed in life after death, denied the concept of life after death. Believed in, over here, denied the concept of reward, denied the existence of angels and demons, whereas the Pharisees did believe in that. So just 2 main points about them. To illustrate the great divide that occurred, you look at Matthew 23. Jesus had a lot to say about the Pharisees, about how they conducted their lives. They bind heavy burdens on everybody else. All the works they do to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries, and this was a leather strap that was on their head. They loved the uppermost seats, and of course the bigger the phylactery, the more pious they were supposed to be. Because I have a lot of scriptures up here in this little thing on my head. You know I'm a religious guy. That's the way they did it. And of course Jesus pronounces at least 23 woes, numerous woes of them in Matthew 23 because of the way they like to be referred. Besides other condemnations, there's a group called the scribes that were also Pharisees as well. They were experts in the law. We're not going to talk, since I took some time at the beginning, I just want to say that they were prominent during that time, and the scribes that were part of the Pharisees arose and created some disturbance. In another, I call it twist of events that occurred in the book of Acts, you had Paul being prepared to be brought before the Sanhedrin, and Paul looked out and he saw some Pharisees over here, and he saw some Sadducees over here. And what did he say to the whole audience? I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and I believe in the resurrection. And these groups got mad at each other. Paul knew what he was doing, because the captain of the guard actually rescued Paul at that time. So I'm just saying that's how much opposed they were to each other, even in a time when they were together against Paul. When Paul brought up the fact that he was a Pharisee and he believed in the resurrection, it got the 2 groups fighting each other. Now, a third group, the Essenes. We don't find this group named in the New Testament, but it's known from the writings of Josephus. They lived their very ascetic lives, which was, I guess you'd say, very obscure type lives, away from everything else. Austere is the word I'm looking for. Self-discipline, especially in regard to religious devotion. Some people say John the Baptist and James, the brother of the Lord, were Essenes. They could have been. They lived lives that were very austere in their own way, but I'm not sure they were part of this group. But they did not condemn marriage as wrong, but they expected members to be celibate. And the way they perpetuated their community was adopting male children. When you joined them, your possessions were given to the community. 3-year probation required before full membership required. So if you're planning on becoming a member of the Hartselle Church of Christ, we've got a 3-year probation. No, we don't. Can you imagine going into a group, you got a 3-year probation before you can be recognized? But that was their case. They were even more rigid in their understanding and the application of the law. They believed in these things at the bottom, which were good things: piety to God, justice to man, hate the wicked, assist the righteous, injure no one, speak the truth. All very godly things, but you take it to the extreme and it becomes something that's not very good. Avoid robbery and theft. Some of their rules. Now here's some of the rules they had. I'm not talking about religious-wise, but if you lived among them, you bathed if you were touched by a stranger or a lower grade of their own society. You bathed before and after meals and after any intimate activities. I don't know about this one. Do not spit in an assembly, but it's absolutely essential, spit to your right side. I don't know where that one came from, but that was one of their rules. Baptisms produce bodily purity, which leads to celibacy, resulting in spiritual purity and meek and lowly spirit, and this also cleanses one of all anger and malice, supposedly. End result, and a scene going through all of this will be a holy temple for the Holy Spirit, which indeed we are the temple of God, but they were said that you got purified by bathing and all of that in order to get into this situation. Next to God, Moses was honored, the Sabbath carefully kept, food eaten only when prepared by their own members, food never cooked on the Sabbath, slavery, war, and commerce were forbidden. I don't know where they came up with all this. Slavery and war were things that I would wish we could forbid. I don't know about commerce, but this tells you a little bit more about them. Before sunrise began their prayer and their praise, said grace before and after each meal, good. Ate only one kind of food at a meal, rejected the use of oaths. They were originally separatist people, lived on the western shores of the Dead Sea, up in this area right here. And keep this in mind, where the Dead Sea is here, this is where the Essenes lived as a community up in this area here. As I said, even though they were never mentioned in the Bible, there are some possible references to them. Jesus talks about people referring to oaths, keeping oaths. There are some people, Jesus said, that will say you must abstain from marriage, and some forbidding to marry, that Paul said in 1 Timothy, a possible allusion to the Essenes. I can't say that for sure. Now we get down to the Zealots, and this is where it involves us with Simon, and I'm going to go through this probably fairly quickly so I can get to the points at the end. And it seems that they were established in the early 1st century, about 6 AD, and there was a tax that was put in place by Cyrenius, and Luke references a taxation during this time, and Luke said the world should be in tax, and the word census above indicates that. And of course, Cyrenius became governor in 6 AD, and it is related to that period of time. This group seemed to form. But a primary focus of the Zealots were that they hated the Romans. They hated, and I mean the word hated, the Romans. They believed that only God had the right to rule over the Jews. One may believe, quoting from Josephus about the Zealots, they agree in all other things with the Pharisees, but have an inviolable attachment to liberty, and say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. If the Romans are ruling, that's wrong. The only one you can serve will be God, and that's true in one regard. We can still serve God what other circumstances, but they said we got to get rid of the Romans so that we only serve God. They interpreted the law literally. Unlike the Pharisees who believed in compromise, the Zealots were militant and violent, thus very uncompromising, not like the others. Seemed to be more politically motivated than other groups. Main goal of the Zealots to overthrow the Roman rule or Roman occupation. They believed they were doing God's work by assassinating Roman soldiers, Roman leaders, and anyone who opposed them and carried out this agenda. And it's in another slide, I think, but they were very opposed to the Sadducees, so they wanted to kill Sadducees as well, and Pharisees. They were hoping for a Messiah who would lead them in overthrowing the Romans and restore the kingdom. They resorted to terrorism and secret, probably guerrilla-type warfare or aquatic warfare. They were willing to fight and die. They were nationalistic patriotism. For them, nationalistic patriotism for their land and their devotion to their religion were one and the same. In other words, my devotion to my country and my devotion to God are one and the same. And biblically we find this group and their leader referenced in Acts 5 when Judas and his group of zealots waged a rebellion. And look at this scripture right here. You remember when Peter and John came before the Sanhedrin and they were about to be punished? And what did Gamaliel stand up and said? He said, I'm going to tell you what. If these men are of God, you can do whatever you want to do. It's not going to do any good. But I'm going to tell you, if they're not, here's what happens to those people. After this man Judas, a zealot, Judas of Galilee, rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him, he also perished, and all who obeyed him were dispersed. He talks about Theudas and Judas, and they were two rebel men, but Gamaliel refers to Judas here and what would happen. And of course, that's referred to in the book of Acts. They didn't believe in paying tribute to a king, which we know that Christ talked about the fact, pay tax to whom tax is due. As about the tactic, Judas of Galilee organized his forces, staged guerrilla-type warfare. The Romans crushed the rebellion and killed Judas of Galilee and his sons as well. With this defeat of the revolt of Judas, many of the remaining devotees went underground. They still wanted to be there to fight against the Romans. They became more selective in their attacks, and the secret assassins out of this group were brought about, a group called the Sicarii, or the dagger men, because of their deadly curved daggers. They performed sneak attacks on Roman soldiers and politicians, stabbing them in the back between the ribs, very expertly piercing the heart of the victim. And here is Sika. The way they did that, of course, the Romans, many of the Roman soldiers would always have their shields on. How are you going to pierce the heart? When you got a curved dagger, you go in and you go behind it and you pierce the heart from the back of the person. They were experts at piercing the heart with this little curved dagger, and that's why they became so recognized during their time. They liked to burn places of occupation where the Romans were, willing to suffer any kind of death. And Josephus says they were so dedicated and devoted they would even torture their own kinsmen if necessary to accomplish their task. So there were some internal struggles between them and their own people as well. And basically that just outlines some of the things that Josephus says about them, that they were so dedicated to their cause. Many historians believe that the Roman destruction of Jerusalem was greatly precipitated by the action of the Zealots. The Zealots began killing fellow Jews, especially rabbis who wanted to seek treaties. Remember, they didn't want to compromise. They wanted to negotiate with Rome. The Zealots allowed no one to surrender. The Zealots destroyed decades' worth of food and firewood and besieged Jerusalem to force the Jews to fight, and they took a final stand at Masada. Now, I think all of us probably have either seen movies or know about Masada. Let me tell you just a little bit about it. This is Masada. And from what we learned from history, primarily from Josephus, but other writers, there were about 1,000 people who were, after the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, actually, the siege of Jerusalem began before AD 70, but it actually extended until about 72 or 73. We always use AD 70 as the besieging Jerusalem. But here's Masada. Now, can you imagine? At the end of the destruction of Jerusalem, and for 2 or 3 years, there were about 1,000 zealots that lived on top of this mountain. What happened later? The Romans, during this time, built a ramp, which you see right here, because there's no way to get it. There was one path that was wide enough for one person to go up, called a snake trail. And the Romans built a ramp up there so they could destroy the remaining zealots on the Masada. And here's a quote that I have, and this is important about what's going on in our world today. Think about this when we read this. The valor of the Jewish zealots residing and fighting on Masada during the Roman siege of Jerusalem is celebrated as the supreme example of self-sacrifice for the preservation of the nation of Israel. Today, when the recruits of the Israel Armed Corps take their oath of allegiance, they do so on Masada to remind them in each generation to follow of the price that their forefathers paid for the nation. Their cry of allegiance when they take the oath is, Masada shall not fail again. You think about what's going on in that area today? That's their cry. Even today, Masada will not fail again is we don't plan on failing again. That's why Israel is so dedicated to what they do. But that's just a point that I thought might be significant for you. And there, you notice I talked about earlier, the Essenes were up here. The Zealots were on Masada down in the bottom area here. This is where the Masada was. One of the things I'll point out here, Masada, and let's see if I can find the verse right quickly here. David in Psalm 18:2 says, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." Most likely he wrote that when he was fleeing from Saul. And you know where David was? He was down here near Masada. Actually, the Hebrew word rock means Masada. So the history goes a long ways back about why Masada is so significant. We talked about them staging violence against the Sadducees, and we talked about what they opposed. Now, let's go back to the little bit of time we have left to get to Simon a Zealot. I told you all this to really understand that there were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, and the Zealots. And the Zealots are the ones to which we associate with Simon. Now, whether Simon was actually a member of the Zealots, it would appear from some of the writings, the way they wrote it, he was a zealot. At least we know he was zealous for what he believed in. We just don't know what all he did. But notice, they were hoping for a Messiah who would lead them in overthrowing the Romans. We talked about that. This might make, I just put a thought in here, this might make one wonder if Simon, a zealot, became a follower of Jesus with this expectation in mind. I'm being told he's a Messiah. He's here to take us away from the Romans. I believe I'll join his group. I believe in what he's doing, if that's what he's going to do. But maybe he soon realized this was a different Messiah than what he originally had thought. And I'll just put this note in here. Some of the people try to associate this Simon with Jesus' brother Simon, which he did have a brother Simon. Personally, I don't believe it's the same one. I believe the gospel writers would have referenced it in some way if it were, especially Luke. But there's no reference to Jesus' brother being the zealot. Now, this brings it back to the point that Karen was talking about a few minutes ago. Matthew, a publican, collecting taxes for the Roman government, considered pagan by many of the Jews, especially the zealots. A disciple, an apostle. In that same group, Simon, who's zealot, whose group went to any length to destroy and wipe out the Roman officials, leaders in the government, which would have been tax collectors. They were both disciples of Christ. Now, how is that possible? Can you imagine that Simon the Zealot might at some point had thoughts about killing the Apostle Matthew, knowing from where he came? I can imagine this thought maybe have gone through Simon's mind at some point in time. He just isn't what I thought he was. Could have been a thought. That's just interjected. I'm not saying that's in the Bible. But look at the common denominator. Both are apostles of Jesus. The common denominator between two divergent men believing different things, becoming leaders. Supposedly, I think both of them were leaders in some way in the church in later life, but having totally divergent views. And that's what I point out about our common denominator. We come from all races, cultures, genders, male or female. We come in other qualities, but the common denominator is we all become one in Christ, just like Matthew and Simon did. And I think that's important for us to remember. As to the life of Simon the Zealot, there are several traditions, and we'll look at some of these. These are traditions. We know nothing in the Bible about his life. He first evangelized in Egypt, which is possible. He joined Jude, which was Judas' brother, in Persia. Some say he suffered crucifixion in Jerusalem. Others say he went to Africa. Some say he claimed he was crucified in Samaria. One say he was sawn in half in Persia. Moses of Quirene writes about him being martyred in Iberia. One tradition has him peacefully dying in Edessa. One strongly proclaimed tradition is Simon visited the British Isles there and being crucified in modern-day Lincolnshire, Britain. There's no verifiable record of what happened to Simon the Zealot. All accounts of tradition do say he was killed while preaching the gospel, and I truly believe that. I don't believe he would have been an apostle had he not been preaching. He was willing to kill. At one time, he might have been a man willing to kill for a political agenda. Now he became a man willing to die for an eternal kingdom, which we know about. Simon the Zealot is the most obscure of the 12 apostles. Only 4 verses reference him. 3 reference him being called as an apostle. The 4th one in Acts, awaiting Pentecost, the naming of the new apostle to replace Judas. He's named there, but that's Simon the Zealot. I know I've gone through this rapidly because I took some time at the beginning to tell you some of my personal convictions. But that's all that I can tell you. I'm sure there's more that in history, Christian writers tell about Simon the Zealot. But here's where I come from on Simon the Zealot. We don't have anything in the Bible that tells what he did. My personal conviction is Jesus would not have chosen him if he could not use him. And he could not have used him if he didn't think he was going to be a leader on the day of Pentecost, which is what he needed. And I don't believe he would have been a leader on Pentecost if he didn't follow on through. Most of the other apostles, we have some kind of history, secular history, that confirms that they died for the cause of Christ and preached in many areas, but we don't know about Simon. I'm just saying from my personal views, he was a strong contender for the work of the Lord until he died. And I believe that because I believe Jesus would not have chosen him and allowed him to be with them on Pentecost when he told them in the latter part of John, where he told them to wait in Jerusalem when the Spirit would fall upon them and they would be there to declare his I won't use the word gospel, throughout Jerusalem and Judea and all the areas around. Simon would not have been there on that date if Jesus didn't think he was one who could accomplish that. Now, most of them say, well, if you talk a little faster, we get through faster. If you talk a little faster, you wouldn't remember anything I said. I only have one lesson to do Simon the Zealot, so that's where it is. Any comments or questions you have about Simon the Zealot or any of the apostles that we've discussed thus far? Just keep this in mind. I stated that he's the most obscure because the only mention we have is his name 4 times. Now, since his name is not written but 4 times, and that's all we have, I guess I would ask you, is your name written in the book of life? That's all. We have intermission until the rest of the people come in.